was a crazy year, which is funny because when I think about it, it was. For me personally, I had a lot of stuff going on in my life at that time. And then just globally, it was a violent year, really. If you think about it, we had the Gulf War. I've talked about that in the 1990 episode a little bit. It's building up. We get the 24-hour news cycle starts to happen. CNN blew up as well in the sense that they were covering from the Gulf, about the Gulf, all that kind of stuff. People were tuning in to CNN all the time to see what was going on with the Gulf War. You had the Rodney King video was released. You had Russia continuing to dissolve. We had East and West Germany continuing to consolidate, so I guess that was good. But in general, it was a pretty crazy year if you look back at it, and that's what we're going to do. So let's start with some internet-related news. Tim Berners-Lee made the first www website. So this was the HTML markup language that was used and is still used to create websites around. A simple site, it was basically just talking about the www project that he worked on. It was basically an academic news group. The nice thing about it is Berners-Lee didn't patent the idea and wanted it to be open and free, which led to a lot of the free internet that we have access to nowadays. So thanks for that, Tim Berners-Lee. Clarence Thomas, wow, boy, he's been in the news a lot lately, right? Well, Anita Hill, of course, warned us about the guy a long time ago. She testified at his confirmation hearings about the sexual harassment she received while working for him, about the porn he would watch when he was working and show it to people, and just very other stuff like that. The thing about it was it was very male-centric hearing. So the senators who questioned her were all white and all male. So, bit biased maybe? I don't know. Of course, Clarence Thomas was 43 at the time, not very old, and he accused the senators of being racist. And I guess they responded by saying, hey, we're not racist, we'll confirm you. And they went 52 to 48 to confirm. And look where we are now. The guy's in the news for various ethics violations. Not that he can be held accountable for it, because that's the way the Supreme Court works. But anyway, different subject. For true crime fans out there, Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested. Yes, everybody remembers the name Jeffrey Dahmer. One of his victims escaped and was able to flag down a police car. When that happened, the police were led to his home where they found dismembered body parts, Polaroids of victims, and just all the evidence they needed to convict the guy. I believe he was responsible for killing 17 men between the age of 8 and 91. In 1992, the following year, he pleaded guilty, and 2 years after that was beaten to death in jail. So no loss to society on that one. Sorry. I mentioned Rodney King there in the opening. So we talked about Rodney King on this podcast in a past episode because it was epic. Rodney King basically tried to outrun police in his car. They forced him to stop, and 4 police officers hit and kicked him 56 times. He was left with a fractured skull and permanent brain damage. Later on, we'll get into that. Officers were found not guilty, which led to the riots. And what's interesting about it is that it was caught on a video, and this led off to where we are now, where pretty much anytime police do something, somebody videotapes it. I'm sure the police aren't too happy about that, but hey, if you're doing nothing wrong, then why should you worry about somebody videoing you? Operation Desert Storm, January 17th, 1991, with the American-led forces to liberate Kuwait. Very shortly after, in February. So it didn't last long. It was a very quick war. We had the build-up in 1990. When Iraqi forces left, they left oil fires burning, and I remember these images of oil fields out there in the desert at night and just these massive flames shooting up into the air. 700 oil wells. The fires didn't stop until November. So they started the fires between January, February, and many of them went on until November, months later. So crazy amount. The reason for the war, people could argue it was over oil. People could argue it was over land. Debt, really. Iraq was in a lot of debt due to other wars. And with Kuwait being one of the world's largest oil exporters, they needed the money. And really, Saddam Hussein didn't think that anyone would do anything, but he was wrong. We had George Bush Sr. in office at the time, Norman Schwarzkopf, also known as Stormin' Norman Schwarzkopf. He led the coalition. It was our first modern war in the sense of technology. So this is where we now have satellites and GPS and laser-guided munitions, cruise missiles, stealth bombers, all that kind of stuff really started during this war. And with that 24-hour news cycle, as consumers, we were able to watch this go on. So it's all anybody talked about. They've pulled battleships out of storage to fight in this. The helicopters, the tanks, it was just crazy. Though the majority of the weapons were not these fancy modern weapons. 90% of the ammunitions deployed during Desert Storm were considered dumb weapons, which were the old school of just missiles and bombs and that kind of stuff. Munitions from tanks. I mentioned the battleships, USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin. They were loaded with precision-guided munitions. Yeah, the thing about battleships is they're not used anymore because it's very old technology and it takes a lot of people to sail them and manage them and that kind of stuff. So this was really that last big war where they were used. It did end with a controversial decision not to invade Iraq. This, of course, led later to the 2003 war. We won't get into that here, but it was a bit controversial because the U.S. dropped pamphlets and encouraged Iraqis to rise up against Saddam Hussein, and a lot of them did that, thinking that the U.S. was going to come in and help them, and then they didn't. So even though the war was a success, the coalition achieved its goal of kicking Iraq out of Kuwait. There were long-term consequences of that. The Iraqis lost in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands during the war, so a lot more losses on the Iraqi side, and it became known as the 100 Hours War because it was so short. The military just rolled right over the Iraqi forces. Russia, I mentioned it a bit in the opening. On December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigns with Boris Yeltsin taking over. So June of that year, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic with 57% of the popular vote in what was the first presidential election. Gorbachev actually preferred a guy by the name of Nikola Ryzhkov, who only won 16% of the vote. So Gorbachev stepped down, Yeltsin was elected, 11 former republics left the USSR. Gorbachev, when he was there, he did try to introduce some policies such as political openness and economic changes, which led to that election. The dissolution of the Soviet Union really came down to economy, really. The economy was hurting at the time, and having such a iron curtain between them and everywhere else, plus with East and West Germany combining, they just couldn't hold out. And so they held that election. Boris Yeltsin took over. Grunge music. Smells Like Teen Spirit was released September 19th, 1991 from the album Nevermind. We've talked about grunge on the podcast in the past, so you can check that episode out. But I remember this album coming out. I bought the CD when somebody told me about it. You had Pearl Jam. You had a lot of grunge going mainstream. Cool, interesting thing about the Smells Like Teen Spirit video, it basically was just a bunch of fans. They were at a gig. and they invited him to come to the taping of the video to participate. And the director had a lot of issues, especially with Kurt Cobain. So it's an interesting story. However, that music video was iconic. It's still iconic. Nevermind sold 25 million copies worldwide. Entertainment Weekly called it the 10th best album of all time. I'd agree, although to be honest, it's been played so much, I kind of a little sick of it, which is saying quite a bit because it's now 2024, and that's how much that album and that particular song has been played. But give grunge its due. Like I mentioned, Pearl Jam as well was huge, and they're still around. And it really changed music from the hair bands and glam of the 80s to the flannel shirts and torn jeans of the 90s. And I participated in it, and I was all for it. Another big one was Bryan Adams. Everything I Do It For You from the Robin Hood soundtrack. Oh, God, I hate that song. Sorry, Bryan Adams and Bryan Adams fans, but it got played so much. Like anytime I went to the grocery store, the Muzak version was playing of it. Everywhere you went, that song was playing. And elevators, that kind of stuff is where that was playing. And it just got played so to death. It was awful. And to be honest, it's kind of a terrible movie. I know a lot of people love it. I'm not one of them. The Grammys that year of 1991, Natalie Cole won big. She did a duet with her father, and they did this projection with him, and it was a really nice thing. I liked it. I liked Nat King Cole, and it was kind of a cool moment of the era. And When a Man Loves a Woman by Michael Bolton did well at the Grammys that year. Another one of those cheapy, sappy love songs. I chalk it up with Bryan Adams, Everything I Do It For You, though at least that was original. Towards When a Man Loves a Woman was a remake of a Percy Sledge song, and I like the Percy Sledge version better. Lollapalooza kicked off. So this was major. So I think Lollapalooza really kicked off some of these massive tours of bands, and Lollapalooza was kind of that grungy, rocky, hardcore kind of kicking one. At least that's my opinion of it. So it was pretty amazing. You don't really hear about Lollapalooza all that much anymore, but back then it was a big thing. All right, let's jump over to sports really quick. Magic Johnson came out as HIV positive. So this was major news because Magic Johnson was like a hero to so many people, and to be like, oh my God, he has HIV. That was really shocking to a lot of people, especially because this is still in the era where people were worried about how contagious it was and that kind of stuff. There wasn't really a cure or prevention or anything like that. So it was considered a death sentence at the time. Luckily, it's no longer one. He retired from the LA Lakers, although he did make a short comeback for a while. He wasn't a drug user or gay or anything, but he did get it, which also goes to show you that you don't have to be either of those things to get it. You can get it from sex between somebody of the opposite sex. It also is much rarer that way, but it still is one of those things that he taught the world that, like, hey, you still need to be careful, use protection. And about people getting tested and that kind of stuff. He also taught us that if you get it, you can live with it. I mean, he's still alive. And so for people to have it, it's no longer a death sentence, and Magic Johnson taught us that. In the world of books, American Psycho was published by Bret Easton Ellis. So I'm a huge Bret Easton Ellis fan. That was published in 1991. I like most of his novels. He does a great job of writing characters that are dislikable, yet somehow you manage to finish the book. It was later turned into a movie, of course. And sadly, September 24th of 1991, Dr. Seuss died. So he gave us so much, and is still read, and his books are given away and all that kind of stuff. So he's the best. In the world of TV, Cheers won 4 Emmys that year. I love Cheers. Cheers is probably one of my top 10 sitcoms of all time, and probably towards the top of that list. I still watch the show and I still love it. And it was number 4th in the ratings that year. Cheers is great because it basically went from a bottom rated show, like its first year, it was towards the end of the ratings, and then ended up being in a top 5 show and won tons of Emmys and went on forever. And it was great. And I love it. 60 Minutes was number one. 60 Minutes was number one in the ratings for years. It wouldn't surprise me if it's still up there. That's how popular 60 Minutes was back then. Like, you didn't have as much cable television, and a lot of people would watch those 60 Minutes news reports in the evenings. Roseanne was huge. Everybody was watching Roseanne. Murphy Brown. Don't hear a lot about that one much anymore, but it's a great show. Home Improvement. Designing Women. Full House, of course. They've rebooted that. Murder, She Wrote. Major Dad is another one you don't hear a lot about, but it was kind of a good show. And Coach. So Major Dad was number 9. Coach was number 10. So all good shows in the top 10, if you ask me. In the world of movies, Silence of the Lambs came out. It would later go on to win 5 awards at the 1992 Oscars. But yeah, that's when that was released. And boy, that movie's been parodied. It's been redone, sequels, prequels, books, all that kind of stuff. Well, I guess it's based on a book, so that makes sense. So Silence of the Lambs was crazy and such a good movie with such great performances. Terminator 2 was also released. The second best Terminator movie after the first one, of course. Both equal, actually. I would say they're both great. Unfortunately, after that, they kind of went downhill. I guess they probably should have just left them at the second one. But excellent movie. The special effects in that movie were trend-setting. That morphing effect of the Terminator was just great, and people loved it. Excellent movie. Point Break, another fun one. Love that film. Patrick Swayze at his finest. Cape Fear, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. I mentioned that previously. I'm not a huge fan of it. It had that song from Bryan Adams, and I don't know. I mean, nothing against Kevin Costner. I love his baseball films, but not my favorite Costner movie. Not just because of his bad accent or lack of. It just isn't really that great. Although I do need to shout out one of the best evil villains of all time in that, played by one of the best evil villains in most any movies, Alan Rickman. You need a good bad guy, go to Alan Rickman back in the day, from Die Hard to The Sheriff of Nottingham, telling him that he will eat his heart out with a spoon. Love that line from that film. So at least it does have something to root for, or at least make it worth watching. Couple of ones to call out. Hook came out, Boys in the Hood, Thelma and Louise, Father of the Bride, Fried Green Tomatoes. Well, there's one you don't really hear much about either, but that was big back then. On the Academy Awards side, well, who was winning in 1991? Kevin Costner. So even though he did the crappy Robin Hood movie, he did pretty well everywhere else. Dances with Wolves, which was released the previous year, won Best Picture, Best Director, Best a lot of stuff that year, and was kind of the overall winner, Best Cinematography, that kind of stuff. So big winner at the Academy Awards that year. So that's pretty much it. That's 1991 in summary, I guess. It was a crazy, crazy year globally, with wars and violence in the U.S. and racial unrest and Dr. Seuss dying and crazy grunge music, which was just probably appropriate for the era. Somehow the zeitgeist found grunge music, and it worked because the way we saw the world was quite a bit different in 1991. So there you go. I guess I'll leave it there and say we'll see you in 1992.